Now we begin a new topic, and that's reconstruction. And as indicated on the slide there, it's referred to as a quote, unfinished revolution. And I will get into what that means later during this presentation on reconstruction. But before you are some illustrations here, and two of them are showing African American males. As you probably know, women were not still allowed to vote. But African American males actually going to the polls, right? The right to the ballot, which they now possess. And if you are Southerner at this time, whether you're white or black, it's just the world turned upside down compared to the world before the war, the Civil War. So, in other words, it was pretty much inconceivable in the minds of Southerners that this would happen. But this is indeed what are the results, the consequences of the expansion of black freedoms right after the war? And we'll discuss the various freedoms that are going to be gained, at least for a small stretch of time. But there's going to be reaction against this. There's going to be what you could call counter revolutionary forces against the revolution itself of black freedom in the South. And as shown there on the slide, you have a straightforward example of Southern resistance against Reconstruction. And that slide is an early picture of the Ku Klux Klan, right? And the Klan are still with us today. But that's what you see here is the rise of these groups, and you could even call them terrorist groups, because that's what they did. They terrorized the South, of course, African Americans, but also some white Southerners, which we'll discuss, in the attempt to maintain the Southern way of life before the war. Okay, so this is what we'll discuss: the contours of Reconstruction. Certainly the social dimensions, but also the economic dimensions, particular the importance of land, right? Redistributive land policy. Is this going to happen or not? Not to mention, political revolutions. And as you probably know on your own, or you could gather, Reconstruction refers to the rebuilding of the South from the ashes of devastation. And in a way, historians talk about Reconstruction as really rebuilding not just the South, even though that's obviously where all this destruction happened, right? The war was fought in the southern states mostly. And it was devastated. Its economy, its infrastructure, not to mention the social contours of the Southern way of life before the war. The master slave relation is now completely eviscerated. So you need to rebuild the South. But in a way, historians are saying what's happening really is the rebuilding of the whole nation. This is what's important about Reconstruction because it involves national issues, not just Southern rebuilding. Okay, so did the rebuilding of the nation, particularly the South, after 1865, the end of the war, does that mean a return to peaceful coexistence among Northerners and Southerners, among Southern states, right? The answer is no. And indeed, what we'll see here is Reconstruction being very chaotic and very violent. Now, granted, there's no more battles happening, no more armies involved, but yes, it's going to be violent and deadly. And indeed, you could really look at the next 3.5 decades of the 1800s, not just in the South, but really the whole nation was racked in enormous change, and therefore this entailed conflict and violence. And we'll discuss the examples of this, but just to give you or foreshadow it, it involves not only rebuilding the South, but and efforts to maintain or preserve the South, right, like the Klan, and the violence that it entailed there. But also, you see conflict between disenchanted farmers because their way of life was disappearing before their very eyes, right? With the advent of industrial revolution and agribusiness, so they're going to be involved in this revolutionary movement, right? You're going to see, of course, the conflict between the labor class, that is to say, those workers in the factory during the Industrial Revolution, which again happens right after the Civil War, and we'll discuss a whole topic on that. It's called the Gilded Age, that is to say, America's Revolution. But the Gilded Age involved social conflict between the labor class and what you call the capitalist class, right? And this is very violent and deadly as well. And not to mention economic periods of, depressions, recessions, and what have you. So by the 1900s, many people in the country thought that our nation was like this powder keg ready to explode, right, with all the tumultuous events that were happening. But let's get back to just a reconstruction, right, of the South, right? How this is one example of tumultuous times. Now, we talked about how the problem of 4 million slaves is something that the North has to deal with. Obviously, it's the North who are victorious, the South is brought to its knees, and the problem of how to integrate 4 million ex slaves into nation. And not only that, to think about, the parameters of what their freedoms should be like. So, let's look at this slide here, the unprecedented nature of Reconstruction. So, as stated there, this is unprecedented in our history at that time. We never had any event that resembled Reconstruction. And therefore, we have a lot of unprecedented problems to deal with and big questions in terms of, who should deal with this. Granted, the federal government had to deal with it, but which particular branch, for example. So we see that with the first bullet there, the bullet point. Who had the authority to oversee Reconstruction and legislate Reconstruction policies? Was it the executive branch and Lincoln, right? And you may notice that Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, and his successor, President Andrew Johnson, he's going to have to deal with this problem. So, should Johnson handle this, the executive branch, or should the legislative branch, that's to say Congress, should they be in charge of fashioning policy regarding Reconstruction? Now, of course, the unprecedented problem of 4 million slaves, right? But again, I'm repeating what I just mentioned. What should be the dimensions of Black freedom? Should they be able to become wage laborers, right? That is to say, sell their own labor power, quote unquote, to employers in return for a wage? And this is all too familiar with us today, right? This is the way our jobs are set up. We are employees for an employer. We sell our labor in a way as a commodity, right? We do that in return for another commodity. That is to say, our salary or wage, right? It's an exchange of commodities. So, should African Americans in the South be allowed to engage in this exchange of commodities? That is to say, between their labor power for a wage, right? And probably most controversial, and in fact, you could say it's quite radical, should they become landowners? Now, let's remember, they were all slaves before that, and they were working the land and doing all the hard manual, menial labor involved with plantation labor. Now, all of a sudden, you see all this confiscated land happening, right? The army, and then eventually at the end of the war, the South, you know, most plantation owners have their land confiscated from them. So, What should be the policy in terms of redistributing that land? Should some go to African Americans, to the ex slaves, right? And you could only imagine if you were a Southern plantation owner in 1865, right? All of a sudden, your slaves are freed. And not only that, your land is gone, and there's a potential that it's going to be owned by some slaves or ex slaves, excuse me. Right. Again, I use the description of their world, the Southern world, that is, turned upside down, and it's appropriate to describe it in that way, if you can imagine, right? Also, the big problem of how to treat the defeated South. Okay, and as we'll discuss, this really depended on how you interpreted the meaning of the war. But again, should we treat them as a defeated nation? Just like any other war, when you defeat your adversary, your enemy, should you treat them the same way? Or should you be a little more conciliatory because this is a civil war, right? A war between brothers, so to say, right? As some people conceived it back then. Now, interestingly enough, Lincoln thought of the Civil War in that way. And it makes sense when we think about Lincoln as a politician earlier, right? In our discussion of the meanings of the Civil War, Lincoln, as I did mention, um, always considered secession, right? The movement of the Southern states away from the Union and forming their own nation called the Confederacy. He always considered that as unconstitutional. So, if you recall, he never um, recognized the Southern state as their own nation. He saw them as rebel states trying to get, independence from the Union. But as far as he saw it, no, it's not going to happen because we're going to fight to make sure they never leave the Union. And that's political, right? All right, so because of his view or his interpretation of the war as this political struggle to prevent secession, it kind of makes sense that when it comes to the end of the war, that he's going to be more conciliatory, right? More charitable, if you will, in terms of the South and the conditions as to, them being readmitted to the Union, right? Now, this is going to be opposed to some of his fellow Republicans in Congress, and we'll talk about this soon. They refer to themselves as radical Republicans. And the way they saw the South's status after the war was yes, they're a defeated nation, right? They are a conquered nation. We beat them. They accepted the terms of surrender in 1865. Therefore, the land of the southern states, that's defeated land, right? That's a defeated nation. In fact, at its most radical interpretation, you could even say, once Texas seceded and Georgia and South Carolina and, all 11 Confederate states, once they seceded, well, they no longer exist as states per se, right? So if you think along those lines, and obviously it's more radical than the way Lincoln is thinking about the war, then once the war is over and the South is indeed defeated, you're saying that you are a conquered nation. It's not enough that you just take an oath of allegiance, and uphold to a few mild conditions. No, you need to be punished for this, right? Just like any war we see happening between nations, right? When um, one nation is victorious. In fact, in the old days, what did they do? Right? They completely pillaged the place, right? And did what they wanted to do, right? Of course, this is different era. This is the modern era. but they still felt that they should treat them as any other conquered nation, right? It doesn't matter if they were formerly Americans. Once you leave the Union, you're now a foreign nation. Okay, so this is obviously at variance with Lincoln, right? And we're going to see how um, this figures into who has control and of Reconstruction and how the policy should be enacted. Okay, so um, another problem is the transition of Southern political economy. Obviously, as I mentioned, um, this meant the demise of that plantation system that's been around, right, for a long time, for centuries, right, since the 1600s. Obviously, it utilized African American slave labor. There's that master slave relation that was part and parcel of the system. Now, all of that stuff is eradicated. So, this is a big problem, obviously. And let's recall that tobacco and other southern crops were very crucial in our national economy overall. I think I mentioned this by 1830s, the cotton industry on a global scale constituted about half of our GDP. So, what should we do? Should we, that the North, that is, right? Should we maintain a plantation economy and use wage labor instead? Should slaves now be wage laborers? Interesting question, right? So, all these problems, this miscellany of unprecedented situations and policies and or potential policies, right, that lay before them. All of this was on the table after the treaty was signed. And as we will see, and let me now return to our theme of the meaning of the Civil War, as we will see, whoever was in charge, whether it was Lincoln or Congress, the way they interpreted the meaning of the war is going to dictate their particular policies. And therefore, it's going to dictate the unfolding of Reconstruction itself. Okay? And another important actor in this, believe it or not, are Southerners, because even though the South, again, is brought to their knees, and you would think that, they have to accept everything, all the conditions that are put before them. Well, as we're going to see, they will take advantage of, let's say, policymakers that tend to be more conciliatory, tend to be more accommodationist in the way they should readmit the states. Okay, in other words, if Lincoln is going to say, well, let's be mild in our policies, this is a fight against brothers, brother against brother, and therefore it was a family squabble, if you will, right? If that's how you interpreted the Civil War, well, your policies for readmission will be mild, but at the same time, the South will take advantage of that in their attempt to maintain the Southern way of life as it was before the war, minus slavery, of course, that's a given, but they're going to try to maintain their way of life. But if you have someone in charge who's very strict, who interprets the war as, a war against a foreign nation, well, obviously the policies for readmission are going to be much more stringent compared to that of someone who's more, accommodationist. So again, the meaning of the war, what was this war? Was it a family squabble or was it a war against a foreign nation, right? Should the war be seen in political terms or moral terms? And that's another issue, right? Now, if you look at this next slide, it relates exactly to what is the meaning of the war and how those persons in charge of Reconstruction, based on how they interpreted the meaning of the war, it's going to dictate their policies. Okay, and I call these logics. Okay, and the two logics that we're going to see here in operation are actually contradictory. They contradict each other. Okay, if you look at this, it's the logic of reconciliation versus the logic of African American justice. So here's how it goes. If you interpreted the meaning of the war as I described earlier, a family squabble, quote unquote, right? A war against brothers. And furthermore, you just wanted to focus on healing, national healing, to put the problems behind us and start healing the nation after this traumatic event. Well, you tended to follow the logic of reconciliation in the way you fashioned the policies. And again, let me remind you, this applies to people in charge here, right? Um, if you were a person or people in charge of fashioning policy and you interpret the war as a family squabble, well, you tend to be more conciliatory. And that's the logic of reconciliation. However, that's opposed to later policymakers, as we will see, who interpret the war different, especially after the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. They interpreted the war as Black justice, this crusade to eradicate slavery, and not only that, to provide African American justice to ex-slaves. Now, if you interpreted the war in that respect, then you fashioned your policy according to that belief, right? And the logic dictated your policies, the logic of African American justice. Okay. So again, as stated here, both polarities were based on their respective interpretations. That is to say, meanings of the Civil War. So this is why I set up a lecture on Reconstruction with this earlier issue of how to interpret the meaning of the Civil War. As you can see, it flows quite seamlessly into Reconstruction. And again, that big argument being made here, in the broad sense, is this: that how people interpret the meanings that they're immersed in at the time often looms large as a decisive influence on how the future events will unfold. And certainly this applies to Reconstruction, as we will see. Okay, so let's move on to the next video.